everyone, it's Kelly from Sugar Coated and Chic, and if you know me personally or been following me for a few months, you know that I love to bake and it's part of my blog. So my birthday is on Tuesday, and to celebrate I'm going to do a little step-by-step guide on how to make this adorable little confetti cake. It's the perfect cake for beginners. It's super easy to make. You can customize your own colors and just make it whatever you want for any special occasion. But I'm going to tell you all the tools you need, everything in terms of ingredients, and then kind of show you the step-by-step process of how to do it. Looks a little bit harder than it is, but we'll go through the step-by-step, and hopefully you'll be able to make this on your own. Everything is laid out and ready to go, so I did some prep beforehand, but you can see I've got my icing colors in the piping bag. Some of the tips I'm going to use: the spatula and my straight edge. I've already baked the cake and kind of evened out the layers and have my icing and the other layers ready to go. Just a closer look of all the icing colors I chose, super bright and fun. So here we're going to just start icing the cake. So what I did before that you guys didn't see was even out these cake layers. So obviously when you bake a cake, that middle part of the cake rises. So what you can do with a bread knife or anything serrated is just cut that part off. So you're essentially just going to cut off the rounded part to make sure every layer is completely flat, and that just helps with this icing process. It makes the cake really stable and not really tip over or have that curved edge on the inside. So what I'm doing here is just adding icing to the inside layer. So you're just going to kind of put a big blob in the middle of the cake layer and then work your way out with the spatula and just kind of push that icing around to the side. So since your cake is raw, I try and just not ever touch that spatula to the cake itself to get any of those chunks of cake into the icing. So really just put that blob on and then just move the icing out to the outside edge. So I like to have about 1/4 inch thick in between each layer. So it's not going to be perfect every time, but that's kind of my goal. So again, just put that blob in the middle, smooth it to the outside, and then I just kind of run that spatula around the edge to kind of even that excess off on the outside. That's important because I am going to put this cake in the fridge to set up a little bit before we go to the next step. So you really want that clean edge on the outside. Kind of that right there is what I'm talking about. So again, this is the top. So I'm going to go around it a few times and get it as smooth as I possibly can before I put it in the fridge. And that's important for the next step too, because you really want that top to be pretty stiff and firm and set up before you go to the next step in the cake process. So again, I'm just gonna work it as best I can and get it as flat as possible, and then scrape around that outside edge again before I pop this in the fridge to set up a little bit before the next step. So that's the first part. So this is the next step, and what I'm doing here is just kind of gonna put the icing on the outside of the cake, and this first thin layer I'm really just smushing all the icing into those layers. So even though we did a good job of evening it out in the last step, there are obviously going to be some holes and gaps in the cake, so you really just want to make sure that you're pressing that icing into those layers. And then after that, you're just essentially blobbing it on thick and really just layering up that outside. So there's really no rhyme or reason to how you do this. It doesn't look pretty, but the next step is where it's going to look a lot better. So you're just probably going to put like 1/2 inch thick, a little bit more. So just be super generous and just kind of like push it all around the outside and make sure it's even. Towards the top, you want to make sure that the icing sits a little bit higher than the original layer that you had on there, so you can see there's kind of like a lip and an edge. Because we put the cake in the fridge and this is a buttercream, that top layer actually is pretty hardened at this point and pretty stiff, which is going to help keep the smooth shape that you already created. So here I'm just going to take my straight edge and hold it steady and straight up, and then move the cake stand, so the Lazy Susan, whatever you're using, and keep my hand steady, but then move the plate underneath. So this is going to create that super smooth edge around the outside of the cake and really just even out that super messy, sloppy icing job I just did. But it's going to create that straight up edge. You're just going to go around a couple times, but you can see in the bowl how much icing just came off. So this step can sometimes be a little bit tricky and frustrating, but if you have a hole or a gap or it's not super smooth, you would just go back and put more icing on the side and then just keep going around. So here it's not perfect, and if I was making a cake for a customer, I probably would have done that a little bit prettier, but for video purposes, this is just a really good example of how that works. So here on the top, again, because this is cold and set up, I'm just scraping from the inside out, so that top layer is pretty stiff and it will just kind of guide that blade, but essentially you're just taking off that little excess lip from the outside and just smoothing it inward. So essentially now the cake has this really pretty shape. It's very straight edge, so looks great. So here I'm just going to wipe off any of the extra icing that kind of got onto the cute little gold plate that the cake is sitting on. So really just going to clean it up before the next step. And also I'm going to put this cake in the fridge again for a little bit so that buttercream really gets stiff and kind of solidifies into place. Okay, so now comes the fun part. So I previously added all the food coloring into my icing and separated into little piping bags. So I'm using 3 different tips, and these tips are Wilton. You can get them at any Michael's store. I kind of talked about this in the actual blog post. But what I'm doing here is I put the icing in the bags and cut off the tips, but I also have 3 separate, little bit bigger bags with the tips in them. So I can actually just swap out the icing colors and go around the cake. So rather than having to buy, 6 tips or 8 tips or however many tips you need for the different colors, this is a great way to just swap out the icing bags and use a few tips. So what I'm doing now is just kind of going around the outside. There's clearly no rhyme or reason to how I'm doing this, but because it's a buttercream, it'll just pop out in the perfect little flowery shape from whatever tip you're using. So I'm going to kind of ombre these little blobs up. So towards the bottom, they're going to be a little bit thicker, and then they'll fade a little bit towards the top. But because I'm using 6 colors, I'm just kind of evenly going around the outside and putting the different colors wherever I feel. So there's really no rhyme or reason to how you do this. You can have the same color right next to each other. You can try and spread them far apart, but as you start filling it in, it's just going to look super cute. So again, here's where, I'm moving to 3 new colors. So essentially I'm just swapping out those icing bags with the new color. And then what I'm doing towards the side that you can't see is just pushing out a little bit of that icing, because that yellow one used to have green in it. So I just kind of pushed out the excess green so that when I'm ready to put the blobs on, it actually comes out yellow and not some weird combination of colors. So this is going to be just like the best way to kind of swap out those colors. So here's just a different angle using a little bit different colors, so you can see as you kind of spin the cake, you'll find little holes and gaps where you'll fill in those icing colors. So now I've kind of moved on to that light pink, and again you're just going to go around and find those little gaps and fill them in. So the one thing I love about this little cake is how easy it is, but also how forgiving it is. So you can see my icing is not perfect. Normally I do a little bit better job with that edge, but it is pretty straight. But if you were frustrated in the early process and your icing might not be as straight, or it's got some little bumps or holes, you can actually just cover the entire cake with these little icing blobs. So that's why I also love this cake. And why I love baking in general, sometimes you'll have a plan and it doesn't quite work out, but you can always just modify as you go along. So if you weren't super happy with how your white icing turned out, then you can always just cover this entire cake with these cute little blobs, and it'll be adorable and not what the original plan was, but it will hide all those little imperfections and areas where it's not super smooth. So here I'm just going to keep adding a couple little blobs to make it look like they're fading up a little bit, and then essentially you're done. Now you're done, and you can just add a little cake topper or candles. I'm so excited you joined today. This was so much fun. Hopefully you can now make this on your own.